in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It still looks like we have quite a few folks trickling in, so hang tight for just another minute and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, well, we do have quite a bit to cover today, so let's dive right in. I know that's some folks are still trickling in, but we'll be going over some logistics in the beginning so you won't miss out on the featured presentation. So good morning again, everyone, and welcome to ARCCA's learning session, which is the first of our new Towards Equitable Adaptation series. This webinar is organized by the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, or ARCA, in partnership with the Climate Justice Working Group. And my name is Julia Kim, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. So brief agenda for today's webinar. I'll first go through some logistics and share a brief overview of ARCA, and then on to our featured presentation. We have 4 all-star panelists joining us today, and they'll be sharing a more concrete agenda for their presentations, and then we'll definitely save some time towards the end for participant Q&A. So everyone will be muted except for our panelists, and due to the large number of participants, we ask that you type your question into the question box. Please feel free to submit your questions at any point during the webinar. I'll be summarizing those questions during the Q&A portion, which will follow the presentation. And broader questions applicable to all speakers will, of course, be saved for the final round. If there is anything really specific or a clarifying question, I might interrupt some of the presentations to just ask that really quickly. And any of the questions that we don't get to, we'll ask our presenters to respond to after the webinar, and we'll share their responses, their written responses, in a follow-up email. And this webinar is also being recorded and will be made available on ARCA's website along with the PowerPoint slides, and we'll also share it out as webinar follow-up by email. And please also note that all registrants will be added to ARCA's general listserv in order to receive emails about future learning sessions, especially those that are following this Towards Equitable Adaptation series. If you don't want your email added, please let me know. So about ARCA. ARCA is a statewide network of regional collaboratives from across California that work together to advance adaptation across the state, as well as to, of course, build resilience in their local communities. Our core activities include facilitating a robust peer-to-peer network across regional collaboratives and its individual members, as well as among adaptation practitioners across the state and nation. We foster knowledge exchange by convening regular in-person meetings and disseminating best practices, lessons learned, and resources through newsletters, as well as through these learning sessions. We believe that regional collaboration is critical to effective and holistic adaptation, since many climate change effects are experienced at the landscape level, and we have, a lot of limited resources to dedicate to adaptation at this point. So through targeted resources, as well as ongoing technical assistance, we support emerging regional collaboratives across California. And one of our other core activities is to engage the state to create a more direct channel between key state agencies and local agencies and organizations, as well as to ensure that state plans and guidance documents reflect regional innovations, best practices, needs, and challenges. Our current membership of regional collaboratives cover the Sierra Nevada region, the Sacramento Capital region, the Los Angeles region, which is LA County, and then San Diego County as well. The North Coast Resource Partnership and the Central Coast Climate Collaborative are expected to join ARCA in early 2018, and we are also currently engaging stakeholders in the San Francisco Bay Area, and also have plans to engage with the Inland Empire starting next year. And the Local Government Commission serves as the coordinator for ARCA, and the Governor's Office of Planning and Research is our state liaison, who also serves on our executive committee as an ex officio member. And we also have a number of affiliate members who are working throughout California as well as across the nation. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to me. Now, I'm really excited to introduce our panelists, and just in order of who will be presenting first. So Sona Monat, who moved to the Bay Area in 2016 from New Orleans to work on environmental equity issues. She became interested in environmental equity after witnessing the disproportionate environmental burdens that communities of color face in New Orleans, especially after Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil spill. Sona interned at several environmental nonprofits throughout law school and realized that she wanted to pursue a career in public interest environmental law and advocate for communities of color. She's a program manager and policy analyst at the Green Lining Institute, where she focuses on CalSeed, a clean energy entrepreneur development initiative, as well as climate adaptation and resiliency initiatives or issues. And then Jordan Bishop, she is the Environmental Equity Legal Fellow at the Green Lining Institute in Oakland. Green Lining envisions a nation where race is never a barrier to economic opportunity and communities of color thrive. As a racial justice nonprofit, Green Lining works on 6 different areas: diversity and inclusion, economic equity, health, energy, telecommunications, and environmental equity. Environmental equity focuses on solving poverty and pollution at the same time. And as a fellow, Jordan works on advancing equity in climate adaptation and resiliency, as well as transportation and electrification. Jordan is a Bay Area native and California State University East Bay alumna. She gained 7 years of experience in food safety and quality assurance before attending UC Hastings and earning her Juris Doctorate with a certificate in social justice. Next, we'll have Ernesto Adubato. Ernesto wanted to work to improve his local environment, and he joined Communities for a Better Environment in East Oakland as a resident leader and volunteer in 2015. Ernesto created a curriculum to engage Oakland residents in the planning process through community visioning activities, and shortly after, he became the Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Enhancement Coordinator for CBE in Richmond and Wilmington, and focused on engaging vulnerable communities in climate adaptation and resiliency efforts. Recently, Ernesto became the temporary Northern California Program Director and continues to fight for a vision of planning that includes local existing community at the table and as part of decision making. Next, we'll hear from Veronica Garibay. Veronica is a co-founder and co-director of Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. Based in the agriculturally rich San Joaquin and East Coachella Valleys, Leadership Council works alongside the most impacted communities to advocate for sound policy and eradicate injustice to secure equal access to opportunity, regardless of wealth, race, income, and place. Areas of focus include land use, natural resources, environmental justice, municipal services, civil rights, and government transparency. Ms. Garibay leads the organization's efforts to ensure equitable land use planning and investment policies, access to basic services such as safe and affordable drinking water and wastewater service, and public transit and active travel. Veronica also leads the organization's climate justice regional and statewide advocacy efforts, and her work has focused on developing and maintaining meaningful community engagement in land use and investment decisions at the state, regional, and local levels. Veronica holds a BA in Law and Society and Psychology from UC Santa Barbara and a Master of Public Administration from California State University, Fresno. I want to extend a thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time to join us today. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Sona.
Thank you, Julia. Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Sona Monat, and I'm from the Green Lining Institute. I wanted to thank you all for participating in this webinar today. Just to let everybody know, I am getting over a slight cold, so I apologize in advance if I sound a little congested. So the theme for our webinar today is towards equitable adaptation, key concepts and recommendations. Our goal for today is to share policy recommendations with all of you to ensure that equity is included in climate adaptation plans so that we can protect our most vulnerable communities from the impacts of climate change. Before we get started, I wanted to share the agenda for the next hour. First, I will provide an overview of the Climate Justice Working Group that developed the key concepts and recommendations I just referred to. Next, Jordan Bishop from Green Lining will discuss why we must think and talk about climate justice and equity when discussing climate adaptation. She will also provide an overview of the key principles and recommendations that the working group developed. Next, Ernesto Adubato from Communities for a Better Environment and Veronica Garibay from Leadership Council will provide case studies to illustrate what implementation of the recommendations look like in real life. Finally, I will share some next steps and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So the key concepts and recommendations we will discuss today were developed by the Climate Justice Working Group earlier this year. The working group consisted of 14 climate equity and health equity organizations from around the state in California, which I've listed on this slide. In addition, representatives from the Department of Public Health, Natural Resources Agency, and Governor's Office of Planning and Research were also present. The group was convened by the Resources Legacy Fund. The working group had two main tasks. First, we reviewed each sector of safeguarding California's climate adaptation strategy. While reviewing, we noticed that the plan includes many strategies to help natural systems and built infrastructure adapt to climate change, but there was less of a discussion on how to ensure communities, especially the most vulnerable and least resourced communities, are able to adapt to climate change and thrive after extreme weather events. Therefore, our recommendations to safeguarding focused on prioritizing and addressing the unique needs that vulnerable populations face when responding to climate change. We shared our comments with state agencies as they updated safeguarding in 2017. Building on the recommendations we provided for safeguarding, the group then developed guiding principles and recommendations that lead with equity for California leaders to consider as they develop climate adaptation and resiliency policies. I'm now going to turn it over to Jordan Bishop, who will go into more detail about the guiding principles and recommendations.
Thank you, Sona. Good morning, everyone. Before I jump into highlighting some of the key principles and recommendations, I want to take a moment to address the underlying need for prioritizing. Why is it important to incorporate equity within our resiliency efforts? Here in California, I think that we do a pretty good job of addressing climate change as a scientific and environmental issue. We work hard on reducing emissions. We have commissions dedicated to sea level rise. And while these efforts are vital to our climate goals, we think that there's an element that's lacking here, and that's a focus on the resilience of people. To understand climate justice, we have to first acknowledge that while everyone is affected by climate change, low income and communities of color are disproportionately vulnerable and impacted. Climate change is going to continue to exacerbate existing health and economic inequalities in our most vulnerable communities, and even more so if we don't address resiliency head on. Certain communities are more vulnerable than others because of old, yet pervasive, inequitable, and sometimes discriminatory conditions. Here at Greenlining, we talk a lot about redlining, the practice of drawing red lines around communities of color to mark them off limits for economic investments. So now we see that communities of color are getting hit first and worst by extreme weather, in part because these same communities are often redline communities, meaning that by their very definition as redlined, they often have inadequate, weak, and aging infrastructure and less resources to prepare from climate change. So redlining is just one example of how historical discrimination can still linger and continue to have impacts after the harmful policies have been outlawed. Historically, these same low income and communities of color have also been excluded from having power over the policy and funding decisions that directly impact the well-being of their communities. So when we talk about advancing equity, to really move the needle towards equitable adaptation in California means that we have to aggressively push for climate justice in all future funding, development, and implementation of climate adaptation. So to guide with this incorporation of equity, the Climate Justice Working Group developed the guiding principles and recommendations that Sona referred to. As she said, many minds and a lot of hard work went into these considerations for California leaders to think about in future adaptation and resilience efforts. So we've included some of the principles here, but they can be found in full and completely fleshed out in the document that was prepared by the working group. I believe this document was shared with the webinar in June, and we can make sure that it's also included with the webinar presentation follow-up. We don't have time to go over each one of the principles, but I do want to highlight a few of them with you. The first, of course, is community engagement. This is the overarching principle and a must-have, includes only the community itself knows what it needs to prepare and adapt. So we recommend partnering with the community through community-based organizations and other local leaders, not only to create a relationship between yourself and the community, but to bring the community together, because that's where the solutions will come from. Another one I want to touch on is facility resilience. And so when it comes to weather disasters and the immediate impacts, this one is really critical. When we're planning for infrastructure investments, this means prioritizing the public utilities, hospitals, shelters, evacuation routes in vulnerable communities. As I mentioned, vulnerable communities already struggle with infrastructure, so we've got to focus on reducing the health and safety risks that are associated with potential damage to those facilities, as well as potential damage to other potentially devastating facilities, things like hazardous waste sites and oil and gas refineries. What about employment and economic development? This principle really speaks to the concept of a just transition. Are we actively making sure that the emerging green economy is equitable and addresses the harm of the fossil fuel economy? Are we bringing job opportunities to those who need it most? Last one I'm going to touch on is the avoiding negative consequences. As we work towards a just transition, are we considering the perhaps unintended consequences of actions such as land use and property development decisions? Are we making sure to avoid displacement and other negative consequences that can actually increase vulnerability? So beyond the guiding principles, the Climate Justice Working Group also developed a set of policy and funding recommendation. Again, these can be found in full in the document prepared, but we've highlighted some of the important ones here. The one I want to touch briefly on before turning it over to Ernesto speaks to funding. The need for robust funding investments in frontline communities is twofold: to address the existing systemic and structural inequities and to prepare for the forthcoming impacts of climate change. Compared to whiter, more affluent counterparts, our frontline communities have more work and arguably less time to adapt. This requires an equitable approach. This requires focusing our public resources and our vulnerable communities to help build and sustain their resilience to the impacts that lie ahead. So I will now turn it over to Ernesto and Veronica to provide the case studies illustrating what some of the implementation of these principles and recommendation looks like in real life. And we will begin with Ernesto. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. And if you can move to the next slide. So I can start with first, CBE organizes in refinery communities of Richmond and Wilmington, California, as well as East Oakland, in Oakland, and parts of Southeast LA. I have to start first with the extractive economy. The extractive economy powered by fossil fuels like oil, natural gas, and coal. These have a daily impact on our communities. California, although making strides to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, is still a major culprit, and there's still major oil refining, about 20 million barrels per day from 20 refineries. The third largest oil field in the US is in LA. We have dozens of natural-powered, gas-powered plants producing about 45,000 megawatts, and continued heavy diesel trucking and major car emissions. And these have impacts on communities that are close to freeway. Just looking at those two pictures, these are both from recreational spaces. One is from a park in Wilmington during the sunset, and the other from a playground at a school. Specifically in Wilmington, which is a neighborhood of LA, this is a daily impact that residents in this community face. And it's something that has come up. But if we go to the next slide, I also want to talk about the improvements that we've made. So if we look at the grid, with SB 350, the Clean Energy and Pollution Reduction Act, we are able to set a goal of 50% fossil fuel reduction by 2030. Though we were not able to make that same reduction for vehicles. Although Charge Ahead is getting us a little closer to some reductions, we're not getting that 50% gas and diesel reduction. And this was really killed by big oil. And so this means that we're missing a major step that we need to make these reductions that will help our community. But as we go on to the next slide, I want to highlight that we're still working. And so what does climate justice look in practice in terms of engaging the community? CBE started our Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Enhancement project in Wilmington and Richmond. And this was to support research and a vision for more resilient communities. On the left-hand bottom of your screen, you will see that there is a visioning session. And in that session, we focused on sea level rise, extreme heat events, healthcare access, and renewable energy. And these are categories that we had highlighted from previous sessions, asking, what does adaptation and resiliency mean to you? With this activity, it helped identify some of the things that our residents say they deal with on a daily basis and the solutions they would like to see. One thing that they all mentioned was that refineries and local neighborhood drilling, which does happen in Wilmington, are daily impacts that have to be addressed parallel to the benefits that are built out in their community. And so one of the parallel benefits that they mentioned was a cooling center. We have informally worked to create a cooling center with the Suchi Clinic in Wilmington, which is not too far from the local Banning High School in Wilmington. And this informal process has been quite difficult, but we wanted to create a new cooling center in this neighborhood because although there are existing cooling centers, they're not as used, and they're also not close enough in distance. And walking in Wilmington during a heat event can be quite stressful, especially since there aren't many trees and the bus doesn't run as usually. And so it can be too severe. So although we're still working through some kinks with this process, our youth EJ members are taking ownership of this and leading this project. And we're also continuing to inform our residents of other things that they can do to support a change in terms of the just transition of stemming away from fossil fuels into clean energy, offering electric vehicle test drives, and more information about how Charge Ahead has made it a little bit more accessible for owning electric vehicles. But in terms of actually pushing the process with community, I would say another example I can provide is from East Oakland. And East Oakland is in Oakland. And if you know about the Bay Area, you know that it is getting expensive. And East Oakland rents are rising steadily. And apart from that, we've been battling disinvestment and unjust planning practices for years. Many people were fed up, and organizations came together to form the Congress of Neighborhoods to reclaim East Oakland, addressing several issues from immigration to fair share of local spending, affordable housing, healthy environment, addressing large developments and schools. This was done because the people of East Oakland, they know that they're being impacted by more than one thing at once. And I'm bringing this up because it speaks to the real need for addressing climate change impacts from an intersectional point of view. And so this Congress brought together 700 people that created a vision for what they wanted to see for East Oakland. Now, this put an eye on what residents want, and the city heard. And this really helped because CPE, along with other organizations, had been working to push the planning department to focus on East Oakland and assist with revisioning land use in this community that is still the highest at cancer risk in the Bay Area. And it wasn't until after this event that things started to change. So there's a grant from the Strategic Growth Council with it's through AB 2722 called the Transformative Climate Communities Program. They had a planning grant, and we presented this to the planning department at the beginning of the year. They weren't as interested. As we were getting closer to the deadline for the planning grant in November 30th, 2 months out, they finally started reaching out to us And although it was a difficult process to convince them, by November, the start of November, the planning department had decided, yes, we've heard enough from East Oakland residents that things need to change, and we are willing to work with you. And the thing that is so helpful about this program is just how it is structured in terms of with a focus on displacement, with community engagement, and having several different partners at the table. This allowed us to bring all of the expertise that different organizations, different groups that are based from volunteers to long-standing EJ groups to come together and create a vision that includes planning that had been done before. We had an Elmhurst neighborhood plan and a Sobrani Park neighborhood plan, but these plans were created years ago. They don't have the information related to the existing housing crisis, as well as the incoming impacts from climate change. This gives us a chance to update those plans and make it meaningful for the future of East Oakland in dealing with these stressors and impacts. But also, the way that the city is considering us as true consultants and collaborators is something that is new. And so, and I would say that the way that this funding is structured, that doesn't silo the different types of strategies for addressing climate impacts, is significant. And it's an example of the type of funding that is needed to support communities like East Oakland. I would say it is just one tool that helped us to convince the city to do things the way we know we need them to be done. And so above you'll see just pictures from the Congress of Neighborhoods on the left, and a visioning session where we even talked about how sideshows in East Oakland, where it's doing donuts, which is a pastime here, how can that be done in an environmentally friendly way and something that is carried on in our visioning. And so I will pass it on to Veronica. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ernesto. This is Veronica Garibay. I co-direct Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. I'm based in our Fresno office, but we have satellite offices in Coachella, Bakersfield, and Sacramento. I'm going to talk a little bit about building on the policy recommendations and sort of guiding principles that the Climate Justice Working Group developed over the last year. As you heard Jordan talk about some of the guiding principles, we talked about actively engaging community residents in planning for addressing vulnerabilities, especially climate vulnerabilities, land use, transportation planning, so that community residents can help shape and implement key strategies that will address vulnerability in their neighborhoods and will sort of help California move forward in meeting our very ambitious climate goals. But we also talked a little bit about, one of the major policy recommendations was to raise and invest in communities to help address needs, especially in communities that have sort of been neglected from investment and have not had the opportunity to engage in short and long-term planning that can lead to resiliency. So I'll talk a little bit about two examples around how that was done in the San Joaquin Valley and in the Eastern Coachella Valley in a way that sort of helps bring those policy recommendations to life. And I'll talk about sort of how these came together and how the partners engaged and what the next steps are to moving some of these policy recommendations forward. The image that you're seeing right now, this is in a community of Cantua Creek in West Fresno County. Cantua Creek community leaders, the women that you see in the image, had sort of, they have very limited transportation options in the community. So the area is served by Fresno County Rural Transit Agency, but it wasn't the service that was provided or was not sort of helping meet the needs of community residents. It wasn't connecting them to where they needed to go at the frequency level that they needed services to. And Cantua in particular is 50 miles away from the county seat, which is the city of Fresno, where services and hospitals and economic opportunities are more available for residents. And so community residents sort of developed their own informal rideshare program where Julia and Berta from Cantua Creek were providing rides to their neighbors and their friends and community residents just to give them access to opportunity, taking them and their children to the doctor, taking them to job interviews, or even grocery shopping or access to pharmacy services in the nearby cities of San Joaquin and Kerman and other areas. And so when the community started working with Fresno County Rural Transit Agency to through the unmet needs process to identify how to improve upon the public transit system, and just given costs and sort of the level of service that the community needed, that Fresno County the transit agency did provide and try to improve schedules on the sort of a dial-a-ride service for Cantua Creek and the nearby community of El Porvenir. The service was not used and sort of was piloted for a while, and it wasn't used as much as the community had hoped for the same reasons as as they had brought up before. It wasn't going to where they needed to go. Wasn't available when they needed it, and they had difficulty sort of accessing basic services. And so they continued with their informal sort of rideshare program that they had developed. And so then the 11th Hour project launched a Just Transit Challenge for funding in the city of Fresno and the city of Long Beach in California. And we worked with the community to apply for private funding to sort of make their informal rideshare program more formal and legitimize it in a way that is completely driven by community residents, services defined by community residents. The drivers are from the community, I mean. And so the grant was awarded from the 11th Hour project to launch what community residents call Van y Vienen, which is a rideshare program that provides service to the communities of Cantua Creek and El Porvenir. And the service itself just kicked off about a month and a half ago. The grant funds were used to sort of purchase the vehicle. In the picture, you see a Tesla Model X vehicle that was purchased in partnership with Green Commuter out of LA, and we partnered with Fresno County Economic Opportunities Commission to provide training and dispatch service to launch Van y Vienen. And the sort of beauty behind this is that it's used and is being utilized because community residents are familiar with the service. There's trust between neighbors. The drivers know the community. They know where people need to go. The drivers are fully compensated for their time. The charging stations are located in the community, and this is a electric vehicle sort of being used, which supports greenhouse gas reductions and other associated criteria and air pollutants in the community. And so this is one example of sort of what can happen and what can work, especially in thinking about transportation service in small, rural, less dense communities. And we know what transportation service can look like in larger, more urban areas, but in small, in rural and less dense areas, it's really difficult to, one, provide a level of service that can cost too much if the ridership isn't there. And so in working with community, we can develop strategies and solutions that can work, that are proven to work, and that people will use that service to sort of maximize the investment. And then, you have the associated benefits of reducing greenhouse gases and, providing a source of employment for the drivers who previously weren't paid for doing so. And so now the community is sort of engaging. The San Joaquin Valley right now, all of the metropolitan planning organizations are in the middle of updating their regional transportation plans for 2018, for adoption in 2018, and community residents are sort of engaging in these processes to talk about, this may not be a one-size-fits-all solution, but the strategy here is if we engage community, if we talk about what could work, if we sort of rely on the expertise and knowledge of what works in a community, this may be a model for providing transportation services to communities that are not served, but this is a critical service to access opportunity. And, why not sort of think about expending and moving some transportation dollars to support these type of services. This is also complementary to the University of California. Davis is currently working with the 8 San Joaquin Valley MPOs to look at rural mobility needs and how to provide transportation service to access critical services, especially when those services are limited or don't exist in certain areas, and what the cost of that could be, as opposed to providing traditional transportation that, where you have a nearly empty bus going out to really dense areas and coming back empty, and there might be a cost impact there. So this is one example. Onto the next slide is a community meeting that was held in North Shore in Riverside County in the Coachella Valley. The community residents have talked about, the biggest, when we all think about Coachella, a lot of folks think about sort of the music festival and the resorts and golf courses and Palm Springs and what happens in the western part of that valley. But in the eastern Coachella Valley, community residents who feel sort of the region's economy through the agricultural sector, but also the services sector, they've identified access to transportation as a very critical need to get to jobs on the west side of the valley, but also to be able to move, to have better mobility, to access basic services like groceries or healthcare or other economic opportunities like job interviews or getting to other places. And to the community, they also have serious active travel needs. This is North Shore is an unincorporated area right next to the Salton Sea. There aren't any paved roads, very limited paved roads. There aren't complete streets with, complete sidewalks, curb and gutter, street lighting that really allows community residents to move around freely and safely in their neighborhood. And so they worked with the Riverside County and to develop a mobility plan that looked at transportation needs in the neighborhood, and they brought out maps to community residents. Community residents identified the areas that are in need of investment, identified where they would like transit services provided, what are sort of those access points that would make it easier for them to connect to opportunity, what are the basic infrastructure improvements needed in the community. And all of this was done with a focus on improving mobility options between and among North Shore, between communities, the communities of North Shore, Mecca, Oasis, and Thermo, and then connecting to the other larger areas, so Coachella, Indio, Palm Springs, Palm Desert, connecting folks to those neighborhoods. And after this workshop, sort of the county and UC Berkeley and other organizations like California Walks put together a report and recommendations that came from a series of community meetings that would help inform mobility planning in the North Shore area, with the focus on providing people real choices. There is no equity in transportation until families and individuals are able to have a true choice and sort of or real transportation options that will get them to where they need to go when they need to go. And the results are sort of being used to help inform regional transportation active transportation plans are being used in advocacy, and sort of set a foundation for Riverside County to apply for state funding dollars to address some of the mobility needs. And this level of collaboration not only facilitates community trust and sort of relationships between local and regional agencies and community residents, but it also really sets the foundation for strong grant applications, especially when we're seeing more and more that state agencies are requiring demonstrated community engagement as part of grant applications in order to receive more points and scoring. And that really goes a long way when those awards are being made. So, this is in North Shore, and sort of talks a little bit about the work that's being done to engage residents in land use and transportation planning, similar to what Ernesto talked about. And when we're having higher level conversations about principles that call on local, regional, and state governments to meaningfully engage, this is an example of what that can look like. And with that, I'll stop so we can move to a Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. We do have a few questions coming in, and I definitely encourage all of our participants to continue sending in your great questions. So we have one focused on rural communities and both natural and working landscapes. So much of the impacts that this person is currently experiencing in their community are likely to be experienced in the very near future. So fires and drought and potentially flooding, all affecting working and natural landscapes, which include chronologically low-income agricultural areas, timber-producing landscapes, and salmon and other fish watersheds that ultimately provide water supply to other parts of California. Any additional case studies or examples of addressing climate adaptation equitably in rural communities and landscapes that you can share?
Sure. This is Veronica, and I can talk a little bit about that around water management and sort of addressing, protecting groundwater resources from further contamination, but also source protection, making sure we don't run out of water. We have started to work on Sustainable Groundwater Management Act implementation, as the groundwater sustainable agencies have sort of sprung up and now moving really, really fast towards developing groundwater sustainability plans. And one way that we've been able to make sure that communities, especially low-income rural communities, are engaged in the process is advocating in partnership with small districts that provide drinking water to small areas, to rural areas, and with community residents to create disadvantaged communities advisory committees through this process to make sure that those voices are incorporated into planning, into the development of the groundwater sustainability plans, what the fee structures will look like, and most importantly, that they're part of the process to make sure that both drinking water quality and quantity is protected for small rural communities as well.
Great, thanks so much, Veronica. A few other questions. So one is more internally focused. So in order to be equitable externally through programs, making sure that the organization itself has equitable practices in place. So we'd love to hear from each of you about the practices and policies that you have in place within your own organization that fosters diversity, inclusiveness, and equity.
Hi, this is Ernesto. I can start. So CBE, we started to change our internal structure with our transformative organizing model, which is working to sort of just disperse the decision making that we have within our organization to focus on community teams. And each team is comprised of our triad of research, legal, and organizing. And so, for example, our East Oakland team, we have support from a lawyer, from a researcher, 2 organizers, our organizing interns, and they meet on a weekly basis to share and discuss different campaigns and also how to decide on decisions moving forward. And each team discusses anything that affects any internal decisions we have statewide. First, it goes to those individual community teams, and then it comes up to our statewide team, where we discuss it as a whole with recommendations from each team. And given that there are differences between Southern California and Northern California experiences, it often requires that type of information gathering and detailed conversation. Overall, this process has helped to make our conversations more transparent and equitable for our organizers, which can be really challenging when we're talking about technical aspects related to the work that we are doing. By focusing on these smaller team meetings, it also allows us to include our active members and leaders to join our meetings, to present, and also build their leadership, because in participating in these meetings as an intern or as a leader presenting, they are able to learn about participating and sharing and relaying information. Many of our members, for example, in East Oakland, participate in coalition meetings for us when our organizers do not have the ability to or capacity to. And they come to these team meetings to relay information from that meeting that they supported. And so this also helps us to build that leadership and that knowledge for that person. So that is something that we're working on to help improve our transformative organizing model. And it's just one of the ways that we're still working on.
Julie, would you like me to help answer, or do we want to move on to another question?
We have a few more questions, but if feel free if you had anything you wanted to add, and same goes for Sona and Jordan. If you wanted to share a few quick thoughts, please feel free to.
The only thing I was going to say, just more of an administrative sort of principle for for Leadership Council, is making sure that in our hiring practices that we're also, and training practices, that we're providing opportunities for people of color, women of color, to engage in this advocacy and help lead efforts, especially from communities that we serve today.
Great, thanks so much, Veronica.
Hi, and thanks, Veronica and Ernesto. This is Sona from Greenlighting. I just wanted to add that at Greenlighting, we have a diversity and inclusion team, and they focus on making sure that like bigger companies practice good diversity and inclusion models, but we also make sure that internally we're doing the same. And so, for instance, we just conducted a diversity and inclusion audit at Greenlighting to really assess how we're doing internally, just to make sure that we're practicing what we're advocating for. In addition, we have a leadership academy at Greenlighting that trains young leaders of colors to become advocates for the communities they serve, and they provide a lot of different workshops that focus on racial equity, and those workshops are also available to staff members to attend as well.
Great, thanks so much. So we have a question that's a bit more political in nature. So as we saw in the most recent presidential election, in terms of how different counties voted, a lot of rural communities, particularly those, I would say, not classified as ex-urban, but very rural, a lot in the northern part of the state, in the Sierras, where there are a lot of natural resources, voted red. And I think we all know that in order to advance on these important goals, we need to look at progress at every scale, from at every level, from policy to planning to community engagement, the whole spectrum. So on the policy side, having leaders in place who are able to advocate for communities who are under-resourced and have historically been discriminated against or underserved, it's critical to get the right leaders in place. So this is a bit of a muddy question, but how can we better bridge connections to very rural communities to ensure that we get the right leaders elected?
This is Veronica, and I can sort of help try to answer that question. We are a 501c3 organization, and we do not engage and cannot engage in any direct sort of electoral work as such. What we have done and what we have worked on, especially in the last year, is we partnered with Fresno Building Healthy Communities in the city of Fresno to launch a boards and commissions effort to sort of work with community leaders who wanted to and build their own leadership and development to sit on key boards and commissions that help sort of guide community priorities as they relate to water, land use, transportation, housing, and generally public investment. And so we've worked to develop sort of educational materials around local city and county budget processes, how to read a budget, what a budget shows, doing educational materials around planning commissions and, what they do and what their rules are and where, what the parameters are in being in those type of spaces, and, stuff like Brown Act and Robert Rules of Order to sort of help build leadership development. I'm not sure if others on the call sort of have C4 capacities where they can engage in a little in more different ways than Leadership Council would. But our goal has been, and our focus has been on sort of building and leadership development, and also acknowledging sort of the role of co-powerment and how that can play a role in sort of building our expertise and our knowledge and our advocacy, but also building the knowledge and building on the knowledge and wisdom and sort of lived experiences of community residents.
Great, thanks so much, Veronica. A few questions related to communications and engagement. So thank you to Ernesto and Veronica, both of you, for really shining a spotlight on some of your efforts and concretely what you did. We have a couple questions related to just the foundational basic best practices and the key concepts that folks should have in mind when they're looking to engage their community.
I'll start at first. Meetings and workshops should be held at time, place, and location that is convenient to community residents. We recommend sort of schools, utilizing the local schools in the area, churches, community centers to get the word out, making sure that all materials and are translated with sufficient time to allow community residents and community partners to see those ahead of the meeting to allow for more meaningful participation. That there's interpretation provided, that there is childcare provided to facilitate community resident participation, and also when there is food, if it's a long evening meeting, that food is provided for residents who are coming home from work and participating in public workshops after that. I know that sort of funding is sometimes a constraint for this, but we have to do a budget line item for equity, and making sure that there's a line item for meaningful community engagement, because that strengthens community plans so much better. And some examples that I can point to and folks can follow up on is, we worked with the California Air Resources Board and the California Energy Commission to co-host community workshops. Oh, and the State Department of Public Health for Safeguarding California to co-host community workshops in the Valley. And we developed the agenda together. We created structures in a way that would allow for meaningful input instead of sort of being talked at or not allowing for meaningful dialogues to occur, and work together to provide food and childcare and all that stuff. And turnout was really, really great. And those partnering with local organizations and community groups also goes a long way, because they already have existing relationships with community residents that can be leveraged.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to move on, but feel free to jump in and interrupt me if you wanted to add a few thoughts. We just have a few more questions that I'm hoping we can get to. So as you all may agree, we're seeing improvements very much so across the board in terms of state grant guidelines and kind of the focus area to ensure that community engagement is a core component. However, we're not seeing that happen at the same level across all agencies, and there are still some funding restrictions in terms of, for example, providing childcare for at a community meeting, or certain expenses that are not allowed. So, wanted to get your thoughts on how we can better partner with state agencies to work together on how we can better, ensure that there is enough flexibility in these grant programs to allow for the type of robust community engagement that is required.
Very quickly. So I know one of the things that has come up was childcare, and the real issue, and this was during outreach with Cali PA for an EJ task force, where they brought up the issue of insurance and covering for childcare and some of those issues. And so at that point, we realized that it would be on CBE to get a childcare provider for that meeting, because it seemed that at the time, Cali PA couldn't do that. So it's making sure that there is at least some support for the organization to take on that role of providing that need for the community and making sure that there is some type of reimbursement or written grant for that type of consultant that can support that real need in case, for example, an agency is restricted and cannot do that. Because I know that is one of the challenges that needs to be administratively fixed.
Hi, this is Sona. I just wanted to add that I think it's crucial for groups and organizations to be involved in the process when agencies are developing program guidelines for different programs. I know Greenlighting and several other climate justice working groups were engaged with Strategic Growth Council as they were developing guidelines for their Transformative Climate Communities program. And those guidelines have very strong community engagement metrics and just a very strong process to ensure that community engagement is happening meaningfully. And so I think that's just another way to work closely with the state agency and bring up any concerns we have about community engagement.
Great. We have a couple more questions. So we all know that it takes time to build relationships between, government agencies and community members, especially when that trust has been broken. At the same time, it's really important that these relationships are mended and built as soon as possible so that government agencies are able to, share out information that's really important for the community as we see climate impacts, growing. So, for example, an extreme heat event is on the horizon. Government agencies want to get the word out to, share out an extreme heat advisory. And a lot of low-income community members might not have the access to information as others may. So how can we kind of, so to say, fast track this process to so that government agencies can get community members the information that they need?
What we've seen sort of done before is we had is asking local governments or regional governments to sort of reach out to nonprofits serving the community. And in Fresno, there's a really good guide that lists all the organizations in the Fresno sort of metro area that are providing some sort of service in different neighborhoods and the communities, and that helps the city definitely and other agencies sort of helps fast track getting information out to communities is through the networks that community organizations and local nonprofits have built, and service agencies like the food banks or local health clinics, as funneling as much information as we can through existing resources is probably the fastest way to do that.
Great. Thanks, Veronica. Another question, I think this is the last one, and for our participants, we will gather all questions that have not been answered and make sure that our panelists are able to provide some written responses to them. So this person is asking if you are aware of any technical assistance opportunities for people in low-income neighborhoods to build their expertise in grant writing so that they can pursue funding to improve their communities.
Sure, I would point to the Rose Foundation Grassroots Fund. They provide small grants to small community groups or in underserved areas to sort of build capacity around those efforts. And then they also have a newsletter that goes out on a monthly basis that provides support and directs people to technical assistance opportunities for grant writing and sort of generally building leadership development at the local level. And then they have an annual convening focused on sort of different aspects of building capacity of small groups in the state of California.
Great. Thank you so much, Veronica. And thank you to all of our panelists for really taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. This first meeting of our Towards Equitable Adaptation series has been incredibly informative. And to all of our participants, thank you so much for joining us. As you know, this is a really important topic and we appreciate your engagement. And we hope that you'll stay tuned for our next Towards Equitable Adaptation learning session. So just to wrap up on time, to learn more about the Climate Justice Working Group, the link is to their recommendations report, and I'll share that out as follow-up. And please feel free to contact SONA if you have any questions about the working group or about the recommendations. And to learn more about ARCA, you can visit arcacalifornia.org or feel free to contact me directly. And we look forward to your engagement in our next session. Thanks so much, everyone.